Hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. And this lecture is all about Active Directory Federation with AWS. So let's get started. So what is AD Federation? Well, AWS allows you to configure federated sign-in to the AWS console using Active Directory credentials. And this is something that you might want to set up if you already have your own Active Directory domain in your corporate data center and you have a whole load of corporate users who already have Active Directory accounts. So if you've got thousands of users, you're not going to want to be recreating those accounts within AWS. So using AD Federation, it minimizes the admin overhead by leveraging existing user accounts, passwords, password policies, and groups that you already have set up in your Active Directory. And for the users, it provides single sign-on as well. So it really makes the experience completely seamless. Now, before we go into more detail about AD Federation, there is some terminology that's going to be really useful for you to understand. So the first is ADFS, and this stands for Active Directory Federation Services. And ADFS is a single sign-on solution created by Microsoft, and it acts as an identity broker between the Active Directory domain in your data center and AWS. And it actually runs inside your data center. It's something that you would configure in your own data center. You don't configure ADFS within AWS. And then the second term that you need to understand is SAML. And SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. And it's an open standard for exchanging identity and security information between identity providers and applications. So it allows users to sign into the AWS console, the AWS API and CLI using their corporate credentials. And it's SAML 2, which enables single sign-on for your AWS accounts. So let's take a look at the process of signing in using your AD credentials. Now, first of all, before you can do any of this, you need to establish a two-way trust between Active Directory and AWS. And when I say two-way trust, what I mean is that within AWS, you need to configure ADFS to be trusted as your identity provider. And then within your ADFS configuration, you need to configure a relying party trust with AWS as the relying party. And what that really means is that you need to tell AWS to trust ADFS to provide your users' identities, and you need to tell ADFS to trust AWS to consume your user identities. So once the two-way trust is configured, the first step in the sign-in process is that the user will log into ADFS using a special ADFS sign-in webpage, and they provide their Active Directory username and password, so their normal corporate credentials. Then in the second step, ADFS will authenticate against the Active Directory. And then once the user is authenticated, the third step is that ADFS sends back an authentication response, and that response is in the form of a SAML token. Then in step 4, the user's browser will then send that SAML token to the AWS sign-in endpoint. Then in step 5, the AWS sign-in endpoint calls the assume role with SAML API to request temporary credentials to the AWS console. And then finally, in step 6, the AWS sign-in endpoint redirects the user to the AWS console, and they will use their temporary credentials to get access to the console. And from a user perspective, the session is redirected seamlessly without them having to log in twice. And the important thing to note is that we don't need to create any new user IDs in AWS. Instead, we're using Active Directory and ADFS as the identity provider. And if the user should happen to leave the company and get deleted from Active Directory, they will no longer have access to the AWS console either. So let's go through that again just to make sure that you really get it. First of all, the user accesses the corporate ADFS portal sign-in and provides their Active Directory username and password. ADFS then authenticates the user against Active Directory. Active Directory returns the user's information, including group membership. ADFS sends the SAML token to the user's browser, which then sends the token to the AWS sign-in endpoint. The sign-in endpoint makes an STS assume role with SAML request, and STS then returns temporary credentials, which enables the user to access the AWS console. The user is authenticated and allowed to access the console. So ADFS basically acts as an identity broker between AWS and your Active Directory, and the users can assume roles in AWS based on their group membership within AD. So let's take a look at some of our exam tips for AD Federation. You just need to remember how it works at a high level, and you don't need to know at a low level how it is configured. So just remember that the user authenticates with ADFS and AD first. They then receive the SAML token, which is then exchanged by the AWS sign-in endpoint for temporary credentials, which gives the user access to the console. And you can also use this method for getting access to the AWS API and CLI as well. And just remember, it uses the STS API, assume role with SAML. Users are automatically redirected to the AWS console. There's no need to create duplicate accounts in AWS. And before any of this can happen, you need to have configured the two-way trust between ADFS and AWS. ADFS is the trusted identity provider, whereas AWS is the trusted relying party, consuming the identities from AD and ADFS. So that is everything that you need to know about AD Federation between your corporate data center and AWS. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.